Senator Rubio, welcome. Thank you. It's very quiet. Jeez. Yeah. So it's a real honor to have you here and a real pleasure. When you ran for the Senate, many people here are familiar with Senator Rubio's bio, but I'll just say this. When he was running for the Senate, we all knew he would be an energetic and articulate spokesman and legislator for conservative causes. I think what many people in this room didn't expect is the extent to which you would be throwing yourself into the grind of foreign policy and national security work. You're on the Senate Intelligence Committee, you're on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you're working on a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention, that doesn't typically furnish the daily headlines. A lot of the stuff that's out of the spotlight. Just recently, you and I were just talking about how you tried to get a resolution passed unanimously to fast-track a member action plan for Georgia's pathway to ultimately someday being admitted to NATO. You tried to get this resolution passed. Senator Rand Paul blocked the resolution, and you invited a backlash from certain corners. I just want to quote Pat Buchanan, who wrote an op-ed about this, wrote a column about you and what you tried to do on Georgia. He said, but these people, referring to Senator Rubio, he's no longer these people. He's now like part of an ilk, you know. Many of your fellow these people are in this room. But these people will be back. They are indefatigable when it comes to finding ways to commit the blood of U.S. soldiers to their client regimes and ideological bedfellows. So, Senator Rubio, maybe take a few minutes to just talk about your worldview and how it contrasts with the worldview that some of your critics have been advancing.
It's all new to me, so in terms of that kind of criticism, but it's all good. Thanks for the opportunity to do this. I'm pleased to be here with you to talk about this. You know, the foreign policy thing, there's two reasons why I'm interested in it. The first is obviously because these are the committees that I'm on. I'm on foreign relations, I'm on intelligence, and the intelligence committee normally deals with things that have to do with, you know, obviously foreign threats, and obviously foreign relations. It deals with everything that has to do with our foreign policy. Secondly, I think it's important, and I think both my upbringing in Miami, where foreign policy is actually an issue in local elections, I mean, the city commission and mayor races come down to, you know, where you stand on the embargo on Cuba and U.S. policy towards Israel. I mean, these are, believe it or not, and you may chuckle, but it actually has become an issue in the past in local elections. But I think it's impossible to grow up in a community in South Florida, and whether it's people who came fleeing communism in Cuba or survivors of the Holocaust, you're surrounded by people who have been deeply impacted by what's happening around the world and understand that in America, what happens around the world matters to our daily lives. And then beyond that, I think it's important for our country. And I always tell people, look, we can pretend that we're Luxembourg, but we're not. And we're not going to be. In essence, what happens halfway around the world directly impacts virtually every aspect of our life, including how much you pay at the grocery store, how much the toys that you buy this Christmas are going to cost, how much you know, food prices are going to be, I mean, fuel prices, et cetera. I mean, and beyond that, the future kind of definition of what the world is going to be like. I think America is indispensable to that. Do I think we can solve all the problems in the world by ourselves? Of course not. Do I think but I also believe there are very few major global problems that America doesn't have to be a key part of. And I think there's this emerging thought that all the issues that we face today are so big that it requires, you know, multiple countries and multiple people to come together and solve it. That doesn't necessarily contradict our view of the world. But I would argue that there is virtually no major issue facing the world that that can be solved without America's involvement in it. And so the question is, how is our foreign policy going to reflect that? And it really, for me, it's still an ongoing process, because it's this balancing act of, on the one hand, idealism, where I'm still new enough here, and I hope, quite frankly, I never lose this, where I do believe that the best case scenario is still possible, meets the pragmatic realities, what I call the Kissinger school of thought, which is that our #1 interest is to act in our best interest, even if it doesn't necessarily, you know, going to look very nice in the scope of history or when you look at it from a pragmatic or idealistic point of view. And it's a balancing act between those things that and I sometimes don't think they're in conflict, to be honest with you. I do believe that it is in our best interest to stand for principles like human rights and democracy. We can't impose that. We can't always guarantee it. But we should certainly be on the side of it every opportunity we get, because the American example is our most powerful export. Who we are as a people, how we live our lives, what we stand for, what we're willing to fight for, and what we're willing to speak out on is our #1 export. It, above everything else, is the most important thing we'll ever do here in terms of foreign policy. You know, all the other things we do are important, but nothing is more important than our example, both how we conduct ourselves here and ultimately the issues we take on around the world. And in that light, I've tried to embrace issues regarding human rights and human rights abuses. I've tried to embrace issues regarding things like human trafficking, which I think are important. Democracy, for example, even as we speak, not only yes, they're being violated in Russia, as we've seen what's happened there. They've also been absolutely eviscerated in Nicaragua, which just held the most fraudulent election. I mean, it would make, the Chicago political people blush, what they've pulled off in Nicaragua. And there's been very little attention paid to it, except that it's going to matter in a year from now when they have a similar election in Colombia. And you don't think Hugo Chavez and his group is watching? They're watching. And if they see Ortega get away with it in Nicaragua, they're going to do the same in Venezuela. And you'll see that in other places, in other regions, other parts of this hemisphere, after a decade of real progress towards democracy and freedom, which, by the way, doesn't always elect people that agree with us. Look at Argentina. I mean, they don't always going to agree people that are pro-American. But the point is, if you have these functioning democratic institutions, you're less likely to ever have to go to war with them. And you're less likely to ever be in a protracted conflict with them. Because in a democracy, in a republic, people are too concerned about their economic well-being to allow their leaders to go too far off into these ideological adventures. As far as America's role in the world and our general worldview, I think America has continued, as I said, there's no replacement for us. Certainly not the United Nations, not an emerging China, not Brazil, not India. I don't see the rise of those countries as a threat. I see it as an opportunity, but opportunities that from our perspective need to be managed. Those nations have obligations as they rise in influence to step up to the plate and care about some of the issues we've cared about historically. And if they don't, then they're not really going to be great powers. They're just going to be growing economies with a handful of rich people within them, but not really a force for good in the world. And to that end, from a pragmatic point of view, I think that the biggest long-term issue we have to be concerned about is what are China's ambitions with regards to its territorial claims and with regards to its willingness to go into areas, for example, like Africa and exploit it for their own purposes. I think in the short term, the single greatest threat the world faces right now is Iran's ambitions, because I think that they have implications far beyond that region. They have implications that, in fact, apply everywhere else in the world. And so I think those are two very important issues we have to keep an eye on. And there are a bunch of others, believe me, there's no shortage of issues, as you well know. But I think the two most immediate threats that we face are Iran's ambitions right now that are right in front of us, and longer term is what China wants to do. And I don't think it has to be adversarial with China, but I do think we're going to have some areas of conflict, as they definitely want to be the dominant power in the Pacific at the exclusion of. We don't need to see it as a zero-sum game, but I think they do.
Let's focus on a few of these areas. We'll start with one of the two that you cited, Iran. So if you look at what Secretary Panetta has been saying over the last
It looked like beer on the camera.
I know. We should have had some glasses. That's right. Marco Rubio loosens up at 9 a.m. That's right.
That's why this is my favorite organization.
Right,
you guys are.
I stand by FBI. So you look at the statement Secretary Panetta has made recently, both at the security conference in Halifax, what he said at the Saban conference at Brookings last week, where he laid out all the reasons why Israel couldn't or shouldn't take military action against Iran, basically signaling that we have no interest in actually conveying to the Iranians that we want to back up our pressure on them with a credible military threat. He also seemed to be changing the red line. He talked about a red line being the Iranians disrupting commerce, our commerce through the Persian Gulf, as opposed to Iran actually building a nuclear bomb as a red line. So is your sense that the administration is moving more towards a containment strategy? What is being done in the Senate? I know there's a lot of activities around the central bank sanctions. What is your sense?
Well, here's the kind of the 50,000-foot analysis of it. I think Iran's leadership has to make a decision: do they want to bomb or not? And I'm not, and I think if they've decided that that's what they want, or at least the capability. By the way, they don't have to build one; they just have to show that they can. That gives them a certain point of leverage. But I think they're pretty committed to that, in my mind. I think that and I think all of the open source stuff you read basically leads you to the conclusion that if they want to do it, if they decide we want a bomb and we're going to build a bomb, there really is no technological impediment to doing it. I mean, poorer country. I mean, North Korea has no economy, but it's been able to build a bomb, and it's gotten more cost-effective to do it, unfortunately, both in design and the access of those materials. So the question is, what price are they willing to pay? And I think the ongoing debate in many circles is, are they willing to do this at any price? And I don't know the answer to that, but are they willing to build a bomb or get access a nuclear capability at any price? It's tough to tell for two reasons. Number one is that regime's view of the world is not necessarily one built on reality. They have a warped view of the world For example, they really believe the West is crumbling, America's on its last legs. They think at any moment now, we're going to collapse as a nation, our economy is going to fall apart. They watch news reports of people camped out at parks, and they really believe this means the end of America, that this is coming to an end. And I would imagine if you watch some of the cable news stuff after 8 o'clock, you probably believe that too, if you're living halfway around the world and your people going back and forth. But truth be told, part of it is they have a really warped sense of reality of the world. The second is they have particularly the religious leaders in that country, which are the supreme leaders, have a strong ideological religious drive behind their foreign policy, which isn't necessarily built on pragmatism. It's built on kind of a messianic view of their role in the world and what events they could help bring about. So those are two very dangerous factors. So we have to deduce how high a price they're willing to pay before they're willing to walk away from a nuclear program. And we may find out there is no price they're not willing to pay. And then we have to ask ourselves, how bad is it? I mean, can we live with this? I mean, could we build a missile defense shield around them? Can we put military platforms around it to contain them? And I don't think there's anything wrong with, creating a contingency plan in case all else fails to do that. But it certainly shouldn't be plan A, plan B, or plan C for a lot of reasons. First of all, a nuclear Iran would be an existential threat to Israel. I mean, right out of the bat. I mean, and I think Israel views it that way. And by the way, it's hard to lecture a country and tell them, hey, you really should take certain options on the table when you believe. I mean, here's the bottom line. If tomorrow Canada lost its mind and decided we are going to eviscerate the United States, and what we're going to do is build a nuclear arsenal, and we are going to target your 20 major cities and wipe you off the face of the earth until every American leaves America, how do you think we would respond to that? I think we would respond to that by saying, oh, no, you're not, and we're going to do everything we can to keep you from carrying that out. That's what Israel faces, except Israel doesn't just have problems from its neighbor in Iran or from its neighboring country in Iran. It has instability all around it. So I think it's really unfortunate that we have an administration lecturing Israel about what their options should be when their very existence is at risk if, in fact, Iran acts as a nuclear weapon and the mechanisms to deliver it. So that's problem number one in terms of that. I think that the second thing we need to understand is that this will lead to a regional arms race. There's no way the Saudis are going to sit back and allow for there to be a Shia bomb without there being a Sunni bomb. And so you're going to have an issue with regards to that. And then you have all of the Gulf kingdoms who also would look at something like that as a real threat as well, unless Saudi Arabia has lost confidence, unfortunately, in the U.S.'s commitment to the region. Then you look at this containment strategy, if that's in fact the direction the administration's moving, and it has challenges. We're pulling out of Afghanistan, we're pulling out of Iraq, we're pulling out of the region. Certainly, I mean, they would tell you that they'll have a presence in the Mediterranean and in Bahrain, but in order to carry operations, you have to have a stable military presence in the region in order to carry that out. I mean, for example, how did we do that in the days of the Cold War, where we had a significant military presence in Western Europe that allowed us to build a defense shield to protect our neighbors at a time where we're headed in the opposite direction right now as it is? How are you going to unwind that? How are you going to go back? Boy, it would really be helpful if there was a permanent U.S. military presence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places like that to help build this containment strategy, both economically and militarily. So the administration, in fairness, would tell you that when they took office, the whole world was kind of dubious about the Iranian process. The United States reached out to Iran, and now the world has no doubt who the bad guy is in this endeavor. And, they argue that, and I can see some of their arguments in that. But I think at the end of the day, we wasted a long time. The truth is, we never had hope of turning these folks around. What we need to deduce now is how high are they willing to pay? Because this is what I would say, and this is the way I've couched it. I think the idea of Iran having a nuclear capability is so horrifying that there's virtually no realistic option that should be off the table for the United States. That's how horrifying the prospect of it. That's how big a deal this is. And the fact that we're tired and fatigued, perhaps because of conflicts in other parts of the world, the fact that we're kind of having this post-9/11 fatigue in terms of confronting these issues around the world does not diminish the threat that Iran poses on a scale that I think has few precedents in human history for the United States.
You've been outspoken on the future of the Assad regime. You've spoken about the human catastrophe. You've spoken about the strategic significance of puncturing a hole into Iran's most important, really only Arab ally. You've also traveled the region. You've been to Libya in a post-Gaddafi regime situation, and you see the aftermath and the challenges that are presented to us in terms of nation building and these post-war situations. How do you talk about it back here? How do you, when you talk, you have a very strong view on Syria. post-regime, post-Assad Syria would be a very challenging situation for the United States, not an unimportant one. How do you think about it?
Right now, I mean, Syria is about two things. Number one is about which side of the debate is. If the United States goes around the world saying, hey, listen to us, be our friend, be on our side on issues because we care about you as people, we care about democracy, we care about freedom, we care about opportunity. But when people stand up for themselves and fight for these things, we're like, oh, it's none of our business, you know, you're on your own. It really undermines that argument. So if the United States goes around the world saying the reason why we're different than China, the reason why we're different than Russia, the reason why you should be our friend and our ally is because we care about you and we care about your freedom. But then when you fight up for your freedom, we tell you to go away, you're on your own, thank you, but we're too busy. It really undermines that argument. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it really hurts Iran. If Iran loses Syria, it's a major blow. You want to put them on the defensive. It would be a major blow. So I think this happens to be two things that come together. Number one, a people that are demanding more opportunity and more freedom in their society, combined with an opportunity to deal a real mortal blow, or at least a very serious blow, to Iran and its designs for regional domination. And so I think it's an easy deal, and as far as what side we need to be on. Now the question is tactically, how do you accomplish that? And the good news is you have the Arab League has risen up to take this on. Turkey has really asserted itself in that. And so I think the United States could very much play a complementary role in it. I think I wish we would have spoken out earlier and more confidently about it. Again, the administration has a list of reasons why they haven't done that, but they're moving in the right direction in that regard. But I wish we had been more assertive earlier. I think we'd be further on the process now. But now you have the Arab League that has stood up. Now you have Turkey that has stood up. And I think that gives us two mechanisms that we can be supportive of to really help influence events there and moving forward. What's really important is that the future of Syria, the future leaders of Syria, clearly understand who was against them in their ambitions and who was with them in their ambitions. And they need to understand the United States was with them. Now, does that mean that they're going to come to power a bunch of Western, liberals, small L, or Democrats, small D? No, I don't know the answer to that. They may come to power people with very offensive views of the world. We can't guarantee that. But certainly, I think it'll help us if the people who come to power at least identify us as having been on their side, which is the case in Libya. I mean, Libya is very complicated now. They had a major civil war. It was a protracted conflict. It destroyed infrastructure. It destroyed lives. It left a lot of young men injured and maimed. People who should now be rebuilding the country are instead in hospitals, getting trained to live with prosthetics. Worse, many of them died. So it was a protracted conflict in a country that already had deep psychological scars from 30 years of being run by a maniac. And so they're recovering from all that. But I can tell you from having been there that the people in the street at least understand who was on their side. And I think it's hopeful that we have the opportunity in Libya to create a country that is Arab, a country that is Muslim, and a country that is pro-American, or at least has the opportunity to have significant pro-American elements in its government and in its society. And I think that's very promising, and I think that's an important advance forward.
In Afghanistan, despite the president's reduction of the troop surge, the withdrawal of the troop surge numbers, it's reported that General Allen wants to keep the 68,000 troop level once the surge troops are withdrawn until 2014. There are press reports, speculation that the administration wants to actually draw down even further, perhaps at the NATO summit in May. What are you hearing and what are you thinking in terms of making the case for our future presence in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I've always wanted, I think all of us want our Afghanistan engagement and our Iraqi engagement to wind down. The question is, how do you do it and on what baselines? I think the president's doing it, quite frankly, on the basis of I need to fulfill a campaign promise, and I need to figure out a way to do that before the elections in 2012. I would have preferred that he had done it under the guideline of progress, clear benchmarks of progress, and it's going to take time to get there. It's going to take a long time, for example, to provide the level of security that they need in Afghanistan to allow them to build a functional nation state and a functional society. And it may never look like Canada, and it may never look like some of these other countries we deal with, but certainly it'll at least be enough to stand up on its own and provide a place that at a minimum is not a safe haven for terrorist activity, and hopefully maybe even be a place where the United States could have friendly relations and a base of operations logistically and otherwise for our interests in the region. And so I think what you're hearing from the military folks is that this is moving too fast, and that in fact the withdrawal that we are doing is creating a vacuum which is encouraging insurgents to rise up again, is encouraging the reformation of some of these forces that threaten the security and stability of the country. And the people that we're dealing with, the people on the other side of this conflict, are not dumb. I mean, they read the same newspapers we do, and they get it. I mean, they're more than happy to wait until we're gone and then assert themselves. And the people we're trying to get on our side understand that too. You have a lot of people out there. You're asking, for example, tribal leaders in certain neighborhoods or cities to be on our side. Well, they're not going to do that if they think a year from now we're gone, the security forces will collapse, and they'll have to deal with the Taliban and the retribution of the Taliban. So they'll double deal us, or quite frankly, just ignore us until we're gone. And that undermines the stability. The same arguments could be made in Iraq, where this rapid reduction in a political way is really undermining the ability of that government to provide for its own security, and is really, I think, going to force some decisions upon them that could hoist the entire country into real chaos. And going back to our interests in the region, you want to have an influence on what goes on in Iran and around the region. How are you going to do that if you don't have an operational perspective or an operational capability in places like Iraq and Afghanistan? How are you going to do that in a region that's, if Iraq and Afghanistan fall back into chaos, that's prime breeding ground for insurgents, for terrorists to go in and recruit and organize. That's the environment they look to operate in. Lawless environments where they don't have governments that are oppressing them, where they're able to do whatever they want.
On Israel, there's a sense, coming back to Secretary Panetta's speech just the other day at the Saban Center, he said, you know, Israel, as far as reducing its isolation in the region, needs to get back to the table. I think he said something, get back to the damn table.
Right.
And there's a sense that every time the administration speaks about the obstacles to moving the peace process forward, it's always about Israel's reticence to take action. It's about Israel's resistance to engaging with the Palestinians. It's about Israel's resistance to making any kind of meaningful concessions. How do you respond?
Because there's a general worldview. This speaks to the general worldview of the administration, which is that the reason why the United States is not effective around the world is because we don't have credibility, because people think we're trying to impose things on them. So the way the United States should function is that we should go in and say, hey, you know, we're just here. We don't mean to offend anybody. We want to be cooperative with you. We want to say nice things to you, and we want to appease you. And if we do that, especially with people that don't like us, then maybe you'll soften up and see it our way. I think the same is true when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. They feel like the United States will have more credibility if we somehow show the Palestinians that we're not just puppets of Israel, that we don't just do everything Israel wants. Here's the problem. You're asking Israel to negotiate with people that do not believe that Israel should exist. That's a tough negotiation. That's a real tough thing to negotiate. It's tough to go and sit down with someone and negotiate the terms of your destruction. You know, how fast will they destroy you? How quickly will you leave? I mean, what else would you negotiate? With people that don't believe you should exist. And then who do you negotiate with? The Palestinians themselves are divided among themselves about it. So do you negotiate two separate treaties and two separate arrangements? So it's my opinion that as long as Israel's being asked to negotiate with elements that do not believe that there is a right for a Jewish state, I don't know how that leads to an outcome that's positive. And I get it. I mean, I know every U.S. president, and this one is no exception, is enamored with the idea that they're going to be the guy, or they're going to be the gal, because we'll have a female president one day, that brings Israel and the Palestinians together, and they'll go down in history as these phenomenal figures that brought peace to the Middle East. Okay, every president falls into this illusion they're going to do that. That's a very noble goal. But the reality of it is that it's very difficult to negotiate an arrangement with people that do not believe you should exist, or at a minimum should be living there. And so I don't understand what table it is exactly we're asking them to get to. And I think that's really the fundamental problem that we face here, is that this administration has decided that the way they're going to be more influential and have more credibility in this negotiation is to show that we're not always on Israel's side. What they don't understand is that every time they create daylight and separation between this country and Israel, all you do is encourage, and all you do is, quite frankly, embolden Israel's enemies to take a step further. The Palestinians are not going to be out-Palestinian. And so, you know what I'm saying? They're not going to allow, every time we move a separation, they're going to move more because they have internal political realities they have to deal with, and they have, this is an area of the world that understands power politics. It's counterproductive.
You've been outspoken in defense of international assistance, of foreign aid. A, is that a difficult position for you to be behind, given your prominence in the conservative wing of the Republican Party? And B, what is your thinking behind this leadership you've taken on the issue?
Well, on foreign assistance, there's two things. The first is how we spend the money could always be improved, and I believe that the Millennium Challenge grants are a great example of true measures to how we're going to put benchmarks and measures on how we do foreign aid. So it's not just a blank check that we send around the world, basically, where we give countries money in exchange for their friendship. I mean, we truly are trying to advocate the policy goals of the United States, which are, in an ideal world, we want countries all over the world to be free and prosperous so they can become our trade partners and buy the stuff we invent and build. So that's really, and vice versa, you know, and we've seen the results of that. So South Korea is a great example of once what was a aid recipient who's now an aid giver, and a country who our bilateral relationship with them has been a net positive for the United States. It was a long-term investment. It wasn't overnight. It didn't happen from one day to the next. But it's just one example among others. Colombia is another good example in our own hemisphere. They haven't completely turned the corner, but Colombia is a lot better off today than it was 15 years ago. A lot of it because of U.S. assistance that allowed them to turn the corner on this war against terror, narco-terror in their own country. And today I can see the benefits of it firsthand in my community in Miami, where you see the benefits of trade, where every day, people are starting businesses and employing people because of our trade relationship with an emerging market. Not to mention the Brazilians, for example. Brazil, they single-handedly, I think, maybe this is an exaggeration, but they wiped out the condo glut in Miami-Dade County because there's this emerging middle class in Brazil that comes to Miami and spends their money. And believe me, it's been helpful. So there is this real benefit to seeing this rise in these countries and the rise of a middle class. These are more people than ever that can afford to build the stuff we build and invent, afford to buy the stuff that we build and invent. The second point I make is that there's this urban legend out there that somehow if we just eliminated foreign aid, we'd have all the money we need to wipe out our debt. Foreign aid is a very small, it's a significant number of dollars, no doubt about it. And $1 of waste is too much. But if you wiped out all the foreign aid in the world, you wouldn't notice it in terms of the debt conversation. And the cost analysis would be very heavy. Because in addition to being unable to promote our values around the world, foreign aid, from a practical point of view, is our leverage around the world. Why do some countries care about what we think about a certain issue? Because they really rely on our foreign aid to conduct their business. And it allows us to have influence in the world. So if we walk away from that, that void will be filled by someone else whose interest may not be ours.
One last question before I open it up to the audience for questions. There are some who've argued that the sort of John McCain, Lindsey Graham legacy on the foreign policy debates, their view of the world is sort of a shrinking island in the Republican Party. And then comes Marco Rubio on the scene, you and some of your courageous colleagues. So, A, do you think that island is shrinking? The things you said at the opening of this panel, when you talk about that among conservatives, when you talk about that back in Florida, when you're traveling around the country, what is the reaction to it?
Right. A couple things. First of all, I think some of it is cyclical. It comes and goes depending on world events. And let me say, a lot of people that are opposed to my view of these things are principled people. They can justify the principles why they think the U.S. should not be involved overseas, why they think there's constitutional limits to it. I respect that. I think they're wrong. I don't see the constitutional impediment to our involvement, and I certainly don't see the practical aspects to it. But I think it's a cyclical thing, and I think if you look at it, you look at a country that's struggling economically, internally, you have high unemployment, you have a huge frustration about a national debt, and you can go to people and say to them, and it sounds fair, I see the appeal. Why are we spending $1 billion around the world when we've got bridges in our own country that are falling apart? The falsehood in that is that, number one, it presents to people that you have to do one or the other, that in essence one has anything to do with the other. My argument is that if we have a government that's actually functioning the way it could and should, we could actually do both. Number two is we really have no choice but to do both, because while that bridge you want to rebuild is very important, all the other costs associated with that bridge, including the cost of constructing it, is directly related to the things that are happening all over the world. The materials that you're going to need to build that bridge, the fuel maybe that it's going to cost to get the materials there, are all going to be accessed potentially from some other country halfway around the world. And if it's unstable in that region, if it's difficult to get things produced in that country, the price of building that bridge is going to be a lot higher than it would otherwise be. That's just one example. The products that are eventually going to get transported across that bridge when it's built are going to be directly impacted by events that are going off halfway around the world. You think if the Middle East doesn't fall into real chaos, an arms war is triggered, that fuel prices aren't going to rise around the world, how much more expensive will it be to drive on that bridge for every single one of us, not to mention food costs and everything else. And ultimately, we're going to get dragged into this conflict. We're going to get dragged into this conflict when it's more difficult to deal with or easier to deal with because we're just too large and we have interests all over the world. Whether we know it or not, whether we realize it or not, virtually everything you will do today, because you live in America, is directly impacted by events halfway around the world. And for all these people that tell me, I've had a couple of days ago, someone mentioned to me, well, why do we care about Europe? And my answer is, go check your retirement plan or your 401k. Because I guarantee you, you're invested with somebody in your retirement, she was a teacher, that has some investment that's directly impacted by what eventually happens in the Eurozone. Does that mean we bail them out? No, we don't have the money to bail them out, but we better care, because ultimately it will impact you whether you realize it right away or not. And I think that argument, when you make it to people, people get it. It's just hard to put it on a bumper sticker, So, we have to kind of figure out how to get to that point and keep talking about it. The pendulum will swing, though. Something, unfortunately, will happen around the world that will once again get Americans to be more focused on what our foreign policy is.
Open it up to questions. I think there are roaming microphones, so.
I texted someone earlier today. You know how they do the spell check on your text? I said I was going to go see FPI, but it said FBI. I go, is everything okay? Yeah, it is.
Go ahead.
John Kunstadter, Radzima Photo. Senator, yours is a great American story, and I thank you for who you are and what you represent in the Senate. When do you think that there will be a significant number of people in the U.S. Congress, both Senate and House, or among their staff, who can speak, just to take an example, Urdu, Persian, Russian, Mandarin, well enough to go on Al Jazeera or the Russian or Chinese equivalents and articulate our policy as well as you did here today?
You mean actually speak those languages?
Yes.
I don't know. That's a lot of Rosetta Stone we have to buy. I'd like to speak more languages than two, but I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the good news is that all these news entities that you've outlined all have English language platforms and allow us to communicate. The good news is that we're still so influential in the world that people care what happens here in D.C. It's hard for me to believe that, but you'll sign a letter on an issue and you'll get a phone call from an embassy. They care. It matters. I'd imagine that the same issue taken up in some other parliament or Congress may not be nearly as important. I think more important is that we're clear about where we are and how important we care about these issues. I'll give you one example of a place where I hope it'll make a difference, and it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, was Bahrain. And so we have this conflict. On the one hand, we have this incredible ally who's been so helpful to us. On the other hand, they have this unsustainable internal situation where ultimately, because their leadership and their majority are so imbalanced, that you can see how this thing plays out over time and why it's a prime breeding ground for Iran and other countries to come in and stir up problems for them. So if you're an ally, if you have a friend, you go to a friend and say, hey, we're very grateful for your friendship, but the political situation you have internally is unsustainable, and you should start addressing it now, because if you don't start addressing it now, eventually there's going to be a problem. And what you do with friends sometimes is you try to go to them and create some leverage in order to do it. And so I think I was the only Republican that did this, signed a letter asking the administration not to cancel, but simply to postpone a pending arms sale with them until an internal report came out that outlined what may have been potential abuses during the protests. That report just came out. And in all fairness, it was a pretty frank and brutal indictment of themselves in terms of what happened, how protesters were treated, et cetera. Now they have to act on that. But what does that do? First of all, I think that gives us credibility to go back to some of the dissident and opposition movements in the country and say, hey, listen, we spoke up for your ambitions, but you've got to come to the table and work with a government, particularly a crown prince, that's open to saving your national identity and preventing an eventual Mubarak-style type conflict that then puts you in a no-win situation. So I think that that's something that we need to speak out on, because people pay attention to that. Because the first question you'll get in the Middle East is, you guys say you're for democracy, but you look the other way in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and places like that. And the answer is those countries are not going to go from what they are now to constitutional republics in 48 hours or in 2 years. But what we hope is that they're on a road towards progressing, towards a more sustainable political climate. That means that they don't become ample, fertile breeding grounds for anti-Americanism, but also for radical jihad and for things of that nature, where people have an outlet for their ambitions and their aspirations. And with a friend like Bahrain, you try to encourage them down that road and do what you can to get them to make progress. And I hope we'll be able to do that there. And I think that's important that people understand in those platforms that you asked me about.
Yes. It's going to get you the microphone. Hey.
Hi, Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. Do you agree with Newt Gingrich, the frontrunner in the Republican presidential race, that the Palestinians are an invented people?
Well, he has a historical perspective on it that I haven't carefully studied in order to make pronouncements like that. I think the point he was trying to make is that the claims on the region, I don't want you to speak for him, you're going to have to ask him exactly what he meant. Let me tell you my perspective of it. And I've always been wary of defending what other people say or criticizing what other people say, because he provided that in the context I'm not aware of, and he's much more of a historian than I am in terms of the Ottoman Empire and all these sorts of things. Let me just say this. I think that the Palestinian claims on the region are based on the notion that the Jews have no historical ties to Israel or the land that now is Israel. And I reject that wholeheartedly. I think that there's extensive historical ties between the Jewish people and the land. I think it's important to recognize that the United Nations and the community of nations established Israel in the aftermath of World War II as a place for the Jewish people to have a homeland. And I think his point is, and I think certainly my point would be, that the notion that somehow the Jewish people have no historical tie to the land, that in fact that land has always belonged to somebody else, and that the Jews are folks that have come there from Europe and other parts of the world and taken it over and expelled the people who have a rightful claim to the land, is one that I reject categorically. I think it's false. And I think we all would hope that in our lifetime we will see a region where both Palestinians and Jews could live side by side in their own homelands. But I think that all begins with a recognition that the Jews are entitled to a homeland, that they're entitled to their country in that region. And until you have and I think if that is established, if we could get to that point, I think there are a lot of things that are possible. I think the Israelis have said that repeatedly, that they would be willing to figure out all sorts of accommodations. And by the way, let me just say this, and I know that this is largely a pro-Israel crowd, so I'm not just saying to cater to you, but I visited Israel for the first time last year. What I was most struck with is the access that all religions have to Jerusalem. As a Christian, I never felt that somehow I was in a country that was unwelcoming to Christians. Muslims have holy sites there that they have full access to. Clearly Jews do as well. I'm appreciative of the role that Israel has played in allowing the holy sites within their country to be available to all faiths. They've been extraordinary caretakers of that legacy and of the archaeology associated with it. That may sound strange to you, but some of the history that is yet to be discovered in that region, the painstaking care they've taken to be protective of that, above and beyond politics, is something I appreciate as well. But I think the fundamental issue behind the speaker's statements was about whether the Jewish people have a historical claim to that land, and I believe that they do. It's just as strong, if not stronger, than anybody else.
Yes, sir, over here.
Ed Ross, EW Ross International. I have two questions for you. Number one, where do you stand on F-16 sales to Taiwan in the context of China?
I support that.
Okay. And second, you said you don't want to be on the ticket.
You knew
what are you going to do after
like
the Republican nominee is chosen and the ticket's chosen? How hard are you going to campaign for the Republican ticket?
As hard as I can. I think it's that important of an election. I mean, the most important foreign policy, this is a foreign policy group, the most important foreign policy measure we could undertake is to restore this country. The American example, by and large, to get our affairs in order is the #1 thing we can do to make the world a better place. Everything else stems from that. And I believe that if we have 4 more years of the current administration, you'll have a government's role in our economy that you won't recognize. I believe that wholeheartedly. And I do because I think that this administration has adopted, or maybe has always had, fully embraced an ideology that somehow the only way that some people in this country can become more prosperous is for other people to become less prosperous. And in my opinion, that runs counter to everything that's made this nation different. What made America, that's the view almost all the world has, that the only way you can do better is if he does worse. And the American way has been, we can both do better. And it's not a zero-sum game. In fact, we can grow this economy so prosperous that you can remain prosperous and new people can become prosperous right alongside you. That separates us from the rest of the world. We're about to lose that because we're being told by this president that the choice is the only way that you're going to be able to do better is if we, the government, step in and make sure other people have less. And the day we adopt that as our national policy economically, not only will America be diminished, but our ability to influence the world through our example will be diminished as well. So I'll do everything I can to make sure somebody new is in the White House.
Take one more question. Yes, over here, right here.
John Bonig. Senor Rubio, I know from I heard that the economic situation in Iran is getting tough and all that. Do you think that the economic situation is going to force them sooner or later to make a decision on what to do with the nuclear program? And do you think also...
Talking about Iran? I'm sorry?
Yeah, Iran.
Yeah.
And also, do you think they were offered a new type of like a reactor that didn't use or produce the problems with the nuclear material for use for bombs? Do you think they might decide to take it, or how would you perceive
No, I mean, I think their decision about acquiring a nuclear capability is about having influence. I mean, why does North Korea have a nuclear capability? Because they want to wipe out South Korea? No, because people have to deal with them. Otherwise, they'd be ignored. This is the way people get attention now. And that's the way these countries have decided. I mean, the first wave of nuclear nations was, you know, the Cold War element of it and post-World War II. The second was these regional conflicts, Pakistan, India, etc. And now you have this third wave, which is we get a nuclear weapon so that we matter, so that you have to listen to us, so you have to do what we want you to do. And that's the case of North Korea. And that's the case of the Iranian program, is they want to use that as a way to leverage and influence the region, to have basically power over their neighbors, because they'll have not just the weapon, but the mechanisms to deliver it. And then the added threat to Israel that you don't have in, I'm sorry, the added threat in Iran that you don't have in North Korea is there is a religious ideological underpinning that really would make them heroes in their minds if they wipe out the Jewish state. And we can say, oh, that's just talk. People talk big, but they really would never do that. I mean, these guys, think about what they were about to do. They were about to set off a bomb in Cafe Milano in Georgetown. They wanted to pay somebody to kill a Saudi ambassador in this city. These are not normal people we're dealing with. These are not your neighbors. These are not, Western-style diplomats that we're engaging with. When they talk about blowing things up, they mean that. And they have people all over the world figuring out ways to do that.